Yay. Okay, so today's class is kind of called From Fieldwork to Ethnography. So classically, fieldwork is that stuff that we did, that participant observation stuff. And then ethnography is traditionally what the anthropologist would write up afterward and produce as a text. So actually, the word ethnography comes to us from ethno, or the same root for ethnic or people group. And then a graph is actually the root word for writing. So it literally is writing about people. And that's what kind of you're supposed to do in anthropology is you go off and, well, actually first you start and you study and you read and you try and concentrate on, you know, your topic and learn the language and learn as much as you can. And then you go off into the field. One of my old professors used to say that anthropology is kind of unique in that you spend like 3 years learning in the university, and then you go off and you have no idea what you're doing. You're off somewhere and you basically have to start from scratch and have everything work out for you. So, and then you're supposed to do what we talked about before. You're supposed to document everything, listen, don't know what you're doing again, and come back and then somehow figure out what all those tiny little interactions you had mean in the world and write it up in such a way that people are going to be like, yeah, that was a contribution. And so it's, it's a kind of, I think some of you experienced that a little bit when you were doing your stuff. It's like, okay, I'm observing these little tiny details, but what possibly could I have to say from that will make any sense? So this is, kind of a classic issue or a classic anthropological rite of passage that's meant to produce knowledge. Now, we talked in the last class, you don't have to write this down because it should already be in your notes about what fieldwork should be, or the ideals of fieldwork. So ideally, it should document all these lifeways. It should get us to understand that we couldn't have a kind of racist attitude or a hierarchical attitude or a determinist attitude toward the people we're studying. So ideally, it's going to help us transform, to grow in openness and tolerance and all those things. We also talked about in the last class how anthropology started off as studying these sort of so-called isolated societies. Some of the original anthropologists like Boas and Benedict, they really thought that they had a laboratory of study out there and that there are all these little tiny groups that they had to go out and salvage their customs and come back and bring them to us. In the 1950s and 60s, people did realize that we needed to go beyond this idea that we're just studying these primitive exotics, that people had been connected to each other, and what we needed to explain perhaps more than these isolated cultures was how people had been transformed over time. So we talked about the People of Puerto Rico project and the idea of trying to understand globalization, capitalism. This was something that was on anthropology's mind. We talked about restudies from a feminist perspective, and we talked about how people started to study at home, kind of like the kind of fieldwork that you actually did, sort of studying your own communities, you might say. So these were all efforts to kind of go beyond those old ideas. And we see this in the guest chapter a little bit. We see different techniques that anthropologists use. We see him ending the chapter with this idea of how do we change our field work based on, in response to globalization. So this is something that kind of got, it got realized as something that was important for anthropologists all over the place, not just since the 1960s, that everybody kind of realized more and more that this was a changing world. Now, a lot of us had been arguing that the world had already been changed a long time ago, that globalization was not some sort of new thing, that the world had been global for 500 years in different ways. But certainly in the last 50 years, people more and more realized that anthropological fieldwork wasn't just going to be about going off to the primitive societies or the isolated. However, and this is where I kind of was trying to have you think about your own fieldwork in relationship to the stereotypes that people have about what anthropology should be. And I think I misphrased the question a little bit. I made you, at least your first answers were very self-critical about the fieldwork, which is cool. I mean, that works too in a way and may help you write some of your papers. But I wasn't necessarily trying to make you critical. I was just trying to make you sort of kind of think about the difference between what we expect an anthropologist to be doing and the reality of what we probably should be doing. And so here I want to also talk about the realities of what happened in anthropology. So we're trying to make this change, or trying to make this explanation, to talk about history, to talk about interconnection, to talk about power, and what happened in anthropology. So, even though people tried to do different things, a lot of the times when people wrote their ethnography, it was like closing the book on another people heard from. So instead of talking about people's interconnection and their historical place in the world, it became that classic village by village study that we talked about, where it would be like, okay, I've written the book, here it is, this describes the Balinese, or this describes the Tiv, and you'd sort of put on there, the so-and-so people, the Fulani people, and this was my dissertation. And so instead of talking about how culture is contested and always changing, what happened is that a lot of ethnography became a sort of group report where the people were kind of frozen in time for that 1 year that the anthropologist was with them. And so it actually kind of made me sad. One of you criticized your own field work, and you said, I shouldn't have included that weirdo individual. I should have more concentrated on the group. And this is what would happen in anthropology, is instead of talking about the wide range of variation in any group, you'd concentrate on this group, and the people who were kind of the oddballs or the weirdos or the misfits, they didn't even appear. And so everybody became kind of homogenized into this one without getting a sense of the variation in the society. We talked about this a little bit in the sense of, when you go to a village, you can't see who's not there, the people who might not want to talk to you. I think it was probably important to include that weirdo individual as much as these other people. The other thing is that the ethnography, doing this field work, became your ticket, hopefully, to getting a job, to being able to be a professor, to being able to teach. And so it wasn't so much that we needed to learn about something, it's that we needed to do this rite of passage in order to get a job, in order to find something to do. So it became this way in which it became a way in which people got professionalized more than knowledge production. And this is what I was kind of trying to get at when I asked you to reflect on your own fieldwork. Even though we sort of turned outward to the global and started to try and talk about history and interconnection and power, it didn't really register outside of anthropology. I think when it comes to anthropology, most people would still rather read Margaret Mead than they would your report from an apple orchard. And there's, I guess there is some sort of excitement to that strange place, strange time aspect, but it didn't really register with people that we could talk about other things than sort of the exotic primitives. And within anthropology, it's still retained, I think, for the most part, this idea, the sort of teamwork, fieldwork approach never really caught on very much. It's still retained this idea of the romantic, I'm a explorer going off to find these new people. And so even though anthropologists were trying to change outside and within, to a lot of extent, the realities of the time, as some of you experienced out there, the gendered nature of harassment would mean that a lot of the time, it was still kind of white guys, and it is true that the field did become less male heavy over time, but it was still this sort of white male ideal, the white man going off to study the exotic other. Those were the people who continued to be attracted to anthropology and probably continued to be able to pay for anthropology or be able to be in a graduate school. Other people had to make money. And so the field didn't diversify that much. To an extent, if you were a person, if you were a person of color and you came into anthropology, you might get assigned then to study your own community. And so it didn't really study the power relationships of whiteness that we'll talk about later that really probably need to be studied more than exotic others. So that when people read anthropology today, my suspicion is usually anthropology is not something that you're going to pick up anyway. Very few people just read anthropology off the shelf. And, I don't know if we should expect them to, but this was something that people might have done 50 or 100 years ago. They might have actually looked to read anthropology for sort of, something to do. Now, they're probably not looking for anthropology. And if they are looking for anthropology, they're probably, again, looking for something that is not these sort of a study of ourselves or a study that's going to make us uncomfortable or a study that's going to really talk about these historical interconnections. I guess, people aren't that interested perhaps in the people of Puerto Rico in the way that they might have been before. It just doesn't seem like real anthropology. So you don't have to write this down. This was one of your comments, but I liked it. And several of you commented something like this, which is to say, hey, my field work was pretty good. I did a good job. I recorded things, I made some insights, and, yeah, if I gave this to my parents, they'd probably say, what were you doing? You were doing sociology, or you're just taking notes, or you're just observing. But actually, I can do this. I can be an anthropologist, or I can do something that is useful out there. So this was kind of the, like I said, I asked it in a strange way at first, which I think led to this sort of self-critique, which I didn't entirely want to do. Might have some good aspects too. But I really wanted to think about, how much your fieldwork corresponds or not to this idea of the small-scale non-industrial society, which was the typical stereotype that we've been trying to get away from a long time. So in some ways, in this class, like in our previous efforts, we've been looking at this concept in anthropology: culture, fieldwork. Next week, we'll look at language. And we're going to look at sort of the good sides, the important sides, the crucial, important aspects of it. And then we're going to look at how it works out there in the world, and if it's done anything in the world. And, I think that worked very well when we looked at culture and then compared it with the idea of gun culture. I think we got there a little bit with the field work, except I messed it up a little bit, but hopefully this helps clarify. And next week, we're going to do language, which is a huge topic in anthropology. We're going to look at the sort of the idea of language and how powerful that is, how important that is, but then what has that done in the world in terms of how has it influenced people's perception of language? And why is it that after all these years of anthropologists, there's still all these English-only laws and other things going on out there in terms of language? So that's sort of been the structure of the course. Let's see.